Dame Lillard shot his shot at KD. The Blazers sharpshooter made a not-so-subtle pitch for KD on his Instagram story, posting this photoshopped image that you see here. Hey, I mean, they look nice together, I'll tell you that. And their game would look nice. But, Brian, do you love or hate Dame Lillard shooting a shot at KD via Instagram?
Listen, I thought real G's moved in silence like lasagna. That's what I was told. And, you don't speak outside the family. Dame and KD played on the Olympic team in Tokyo last year. I'm sure Dame's got his number, and I'm sure if Kevin Durant became available, Dame would love it if the Blazers got in line. But there are going to be a whole bunch of other teams in line, and it's going to take a lot more than a Photoshop to get him.
So, Matt, do you think the KD recruitment from players around the league is now going to be in full effect?
I mean, KD's, quote-unquote, that pretty girl that everyone wants, that wouldn't mind having, hang out with. So I can imagine that everybody should and want to take their shot. Everyone is very closely watching, as reported, this Kyrie situation. Obviously, if Kyrie leaves, that's a big deal, but more importantly, that means Kevin Durant can possibly leave. So I wouldn't be surprised if I was Bradley Beal, I'd be shooting that shot right next to him. Come on home, KD, come play with me. Those two guys in particular have been very loyal to their teams, and it'd be dope to see if KD go to either one of those spots.
That's an interesting situation, but now we can play, we'll play a little fantasy GM here. So, Matt, we'll start with you, and Wendy, you can piggyback off of him. Where do you want to see KD play next season if you had your choice of any of the teams in the league, all 30?
That's tough. I'm going to give you a couple. I'd like to see him Miami, Boston, and a wild card. Go back to Golden State.
What? Go back to Golden State?
Why not? It wasn't broke.
Okay.
It wasn't broke.
Okay.
Broke.
Okay. Wendy?
Listen, I'm all for player agency, and I'm all for the guys getting to do whatever they want. They earn the right to have options. But I think it's a bad trend in the NBA for players not to honor their contracts. And I know that is a complicated issue, but I'd like to see Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving playing for the Nets. I think they have the potential to be a great pairing, and I'd like to see it actually happen. And I think it's really be unfortunate if this happens, especially for a Nets fan base. What do you tell a Nets fan base that has a guy under a 4-year contract says, I don't want to be there? So I know that may not be popular amongst players, but that's my viewpoint.
And I agree. Obviously, being a former player, I completely agree with you. I think the best scenario is to bring all these guys back. You have a healthy Ben Simmons, a healthy Joe Harris. But if it all does break down, and George and I were talking about this at the break, think about everything that the Nets gave up to bring in all three of these guys, and no longer Harden's already in Philly. Your two guys are still left in Brooklyn. But what if they possibly, this is, obviously I'm a former player, so I'm all pro player, pro power, get your money. But this really leaves the Nets in a bad place if this kind of just blows up this summer.
Right, but here's the thing. If let's say the nuclear option happens and Kyrie and Kevin Durant are both headed elsewhere, the Nets are going to be able to get a haul that you discussed, Brian, and Woj discussed, that we've never seen before. They're going to get players, they won't be Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, but they're going to be able to get players who are ready-made all-star caliber players, I believe. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just pie in the sky. And they're probably going to be on the younger variety, more on the Ben Simmons timeline, and they'll still be able to get a ton of picks and recoup that stuff. Am I wrong to think that, Brian?
I mean, if you're telling me that maybe they can take a step back and be a potential contender for a playoff spot in 2 or 3 years, yeah. But again, if you look what the Thunder did when they traded Paul George. When they traded Paul George and Russell Westbrook and basically said, we're going to start over. That'd be a similar situation that the Nets were in. The Thunder have their draft picks. And as they're rebuilding here, they're rebuilding with their picks. Josh Giddey was their pick. Chet Holmgren is their pick. That's what they're building on. That's what their fans are now excited about. The Nets wouldn't have control of their picks. They traded. If you're the Houston Rockets, you are cheering for chaos. You're cheering for Kyrie to opt out and be gone. You're cheering for because now the Rockets, and even the Rockets rebuild with Harden, the picks that they made, Paolo Banchero, that's their pick. Jalen Green, that's their pick. Their rebuild is based on their own picks. The Nets wouldn't have control of it. So it's a bad situation for the league if that would happen to them. But again, they are taking steps to put themselves on that path, which is why this is a situation I've never seen before, and I truly can't believe. And my my instincts is like this has got to be a negotiating position, that they're not actually going to do this because we still have 48 hours. But I can only tell you what the message is out there in the league.
Brian, let me ask you this then. And look, you may not know the answer to this, but is everyone aligned in Brooklyn, from the front office to ownership, on this stance that they're taking, particularly with Kyrie, which could then obviously...
I know that the ownership, Joe Tsai, does not want a repeat of last year, and Joe Tsai is the person driving this. So you can you can be assured that the moves that they're making come from ownership.
Kyrie Irving has a $36.5 million player option. Woj reported that the Nets want Irving on a shorter deal, whether it's the player option for 1 year or a new 2-year deal. We now welcome in ESPN senior NBA insider Adrian Wojnarowski. So Woj, breaking it all down for us here now. What's the latest on Kyrie's future with the Nets and his timeline to make a decision?
Yeah, George, Kyrie Irving has until Wednesday, 5 p.m. Eastern, to make a decision on that $36.5 million player option. After, if he opts out of it, he can work with the Nets on trying to find a sign-and trade elsewhere, or he could opt out and sign into cap space somewhere, which would likely be, if he did that Laker $6 million exception. But listen, that would cost him over $30 million just on his player option, and he could opt into Brooklyn. But if he opts into that deal, then, essentially he could still be traded, but just as an expiring contract. There's no sign and trade. And right now I'm told around the league that outside of the Lakers, who certainly have interest in Kyrie Irving, there are no sign and trade candidates lining up. Now, with a sign and trade, you got to commit to at least 3 years on an extension. And the Nets, of course, would have to agree to take back whatever contracts, assets they could get. So Wednesday, 5 p.m. Eastern, again, that's when Kyrie Irving has to have a decision on that $36.5 million player option for next season.
Woj, you mentioned the Lakers have shown interest, but are the Nets showing interest in what the Lakers potentially have to offer?
No. And listen, they can't negotiate a sign and trade until once free agency starts. And so, but if you're Brooklyn, you look at what LA has to offer or what they'd like to offer. And outside of certainly Anthony Davis or LeBron James, there is not a package that perhaps would make sense for the Nets. And I think for Brooklyn, if Kyrie Irving walks, it certainly puts them in a difficult situation with Kevin Durant. I think, but also the idea of taking back, significant contracts, money moving forward, that may not make sense. I think for Brooklyn, if Kyrie Irving is going to get to the Lakers, he's probably going to have to opt out of that deal and sign at what right now is a $6 million taxpayer mid-level exception.
Okay. Now, how does all this impact Kevin Durant at the moment?
Significantly. And certainly, Brooklyn knows they've left themselves vulnerable for a trade request with Kevin Durant if Kyrie Irving leaves. And so clearly, Irving wants a long-term deal in Brooklyn. It doesn't appear that the Nets' resistance remains to doing that. Kevin Durant wants to play with Kyrie Irving in Brooklyn. Certainly, I think he's tried to be helpful in leveraging Kyrie Irving to get that deal with the Nets. It's not happening and hasn't happened yet. And so certainly there are a lot of teams in the league lining up if Kevin Durant becomes on the trade market, if he asks out of Brooklyn. He's got 4 years left on his contract, which means if you trade for him, you have him. He can't become a free agent for you. He's going to play for you. And there may have, if he does end up on a trade market, George, there's probably never been a player quite his stature, certainly at the top of his game, who would be available to teams out there. You look at trades like Paul George in Oklahoma City to the Clippers, Anthony Davis to the Lakers. You would imagine that those would be starting points if you're the Nets. When you look at the kind of assets that you would want back for Kevin Durant.
All right, so we're not going to hold you to this. So aggregators out there, chill out for a second. There'll be 29 teams lined up for Kevin Durant in that situation is the guess. But how many of those could potentially be, and it just could be a round number, are realistic in regards to both giving the Nets what they would want for Durant and Durant also being enticed to play there?
Well, the second part of that, George, he's not really going to have say where he plays. He could be traded anywhere. He doesn't have a no trade. Now, there's certainly teams would measure, do we want to take on a Kevin Durant who's not enthusiastic about being here, but you know Kevin Durant loves to play, how competitive he is. And with 4 years left on his deal, he's going to have to play. And so that opens up, I think, lots of possibilities around the league. I think you look at rosters, you look at teams with high-level players, probably 25 and under, draft picks. And of course, you know, teams can use third teams, fourth teams to do bigger deals to get the Nets the kind of assets they might want if that team doesn't have them. So certainly there's an ability to get creative out there. But you're right. I think 29 teams, maybe 28. I don't know if a return to Golden State would be in the cards, but certainly 28. And I think you would also have to surmise probably a trade to the Knicks in town. That would probably be a tough one. But if teams are willing to gather up the biggest pool of assets, you know, I would imagine, and teams are preparing for that idea, you would imagine that the Kevin Durant trade sweepstakes, if we get there, would be perhaps unlike anything we've seen in this modern era.
My goodness. Could be an interesting time here in the next couple of days. He's the best in the business, Agent Wojnarowski. Woj, thank you so much for the time, man.